What is going on, everybody? My name's Ty. I know ball, and welcome to my podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on this video, guys. I hope you guys enjoy the content that I have for you today. I've been thinking about starting a podcast for a little bit, talking about different sports stuff, mostly football and baseball, but overall, I could talk about other things as well. But for today's episode, guys, I figured what better way to kick off the channel than to sit here and debate college football. So, obviously, with the last rankings that just came out this week that finalized the playoff seedings, it was a little controversial. I have some opinions on it. I've heard some other opinions on it. There's some things I agree with, some things I disagree with, and I figured, hey, why not just put it all out there, kind of get my ideas out there, and see see who agrees with me, see who disagrees with me, and kind of go from there. So, without further ado, guys, just want to jump into it. So, what I want to talk about today is kind of what happened with the last rankings, kind of the flawed system behind it, comparing the resumes from teams who made it, teams who didn't make it, things like that. Understanding the difference in all the conference championship losses and why certain teams stayed the same, why certain teams might have dropped, things like that. And then, kind of how I looked at my personal rankings based off of that. From there, I have some solutions that I would like to provide that could potentially better the outcomes of certain things like this, so that way we don't run into the same situation again, and just other things, along those same lines. So, just jumping into it, this is obviously the committee's final rankings. So, based off of the second to last rankings to the last rankings, Ohio State and Indiana flipped. Everything from Georgia through Oklahoma stayed the same. Actually, through Alabama stayed the same. And then obviously Notre Dame dropped, Miami went up, and BYU dropped. And because of the top 5 conference champions rule, that allowed Tulane and James Madison to slot into those last 2 spots. So first things first, for just my opinions on this. For the most part, I actually don't mind where the rankings ended up here. I'm a firm believer that BYU should have been in here. Regardless of the Tulane and James Madison thing. I don't know how they didn't really make it, but regardless, everything else, I pretty much agree with, especially Miami jumping Notre Dame. I think they should have been higher from the beginning. It really made no sense to me why they had the rankings the way they did for so long. It's cool to see that they were able to self-correct at the end. But regardless, obviously some controversy here, especially when it comes down to where certain teams placed. So obviously the big 4 being Alabama, Miami, BYU, and Notre Dame. So just kind of comparing the resumes. To me, I think BYU had the best resume of the 4 teams. They had only 1 loss compared to the other teams having 2 losses. They had the 6th best strength of record. They had the 34th best strength of schedule, which is the 2nd best out of the 4 teams listed here. And they went 2-1, which is just as good as anybody else on the screen here. So overall, guys, when it comes down to the resumes here, just looking at it from, no biased point of view, I feel like BYU deserved to be ahead of these teams. You'll see that in my final rankings. The reason I'm not including the conference championship games on here is so that way we have an even slate between the 4 teams, since Alabama and BYU did end up playing an extra game. But to me, those conference championship games don't matter anyway, because I don't think they're really worthwhile. They don't provide any value, and overall, it's just an old, outdated system, unfortunately. So, looking at things, from this, I know a lot of people think that Miami or Notre Dame should have been higher than Alabama due to that fact, but for me, when it comes to, ranking teams, one of the biggest things that I always look for is who did you beat? And at the end of the day, Alabama beat better teams than Miami and Notre Dame did. Notre Dame, people like to point out quality losses, whereas Alabama lost to Florida State, Notre Dame lost to Texas A&M and Miami. To me, quality losses don't really mean anything if you don't have any quality wins. And what I mean by that is Notre Dame only played 2 really good teams the whole year. They lost both those games. Alabama played 3 or 4 really good teams this year, not even including Georgia in the conference championship, and they won most of those games, right? So Alabama has proven to me that when they play good teams, they stand a chance. When Notre Dame plays good teams, they don't stand a chance. So to me, it was very easy to leave Alabama ahead of Notre Dame, and then Miami ahead of Notre Dame was a no-brainer because of the head-to-head. So regardless, comparing the resumes, this is why I think it stacks up the way that it does and why I would have ranked it this way. But regardless, obviously the biggest controversy after the final rankings was just the difference in the conference championship losses. And at first, when I looked at it, it was like, okay, like, I don't know why we're putting as much stock into these conference championships as, they do. To me, again, like I said, it doesn't really make any sense. I think the conference championship is stupid. I personally would finalize the rankings before. But regardless, that's just my opinion. Now, having some time to think about it, it actually kind of makes sense why they did what they did. And the reason that I say that is because you essentially had three different teams lose in the conference championships that mattered, right? You had Ohio State, who lost to Indiana. You had Alabama, who lost to Georgia. And you had BYU, who lost to Texas Tech. Right, so starting off with Ohio State, the way that I look at this conference championship game, or just these conference championship games in general, is I'm going to relate it a little bit to being in college, right? So let's imagine that Ohio State, Alabama, and BYU were all taking the same college class, right? So Ohio State's the first team. They're basically in a neck-and-neck race with Indiana for the valedictorian, with obviously the runner-up being the salutatorian, right? So they've taken all these classes, all 4 years of college. They've, stacked up against each other pretty well, and they finally take one class together, and they basically end up getting the same grade, right? So they go up to the professor, say, hey, this is basically the difference in one of us being valedictorian and the other one being salutatorian. Can you give us a test that's only for us two? It doesn't actually impact the grade at all. It's just going to tell us who's number one and who's number two. Right? So the professor says, hey, that makes sense to me. He gives them a test, and Indiana scores higher on the test than Ohio State does. So Indiana becomes the valedictorian. Ohio State becomes the salutatorian. So nothing to shy away from. Still a really good honor, right? But that was just what was necessary to kind of see who was one, who was two, because both were basically tied in that sense, right? So overall, that's why, Ohio State, went from 1 to 2. It wasn't that they were really being punished. It was more so that Indiana was being rewarded for scoring higher, right? And then you move on to Alabama. So the way that I kind of look at Alabama in this class is they're that student who in the beginning of the semester promised their mom that they were going to get straight A's this year. And they've gotten an A in every other class, and in this class they have an 88. Right? So they're right on the cusp of having an A, but the reason they don't have the A is because the very first quiz of the year, they bombed it. Right? So they did great on all the tests, right? The midterm, they scored fantastic. We'll call that the Georgia game, right? So overall, the rest of their scores are what's bringing their grade up. It's just that one little test that's keeping it just below an A. So Alabama goes up to the professor and says, hey, professor, I've done really well this year. I didn't get the score that I wanted to on a quiz. Is there an extra credit assignment that I can do? Right? So the professor looks at it, says, hey, want to know what? You have done really well on the tests. You were actually the highest score on the midterm, right? Again, being the Georgia game. What I'll do is if you write a 10-page paper on whatever topic and turn it in, I could potentially give you extra credit, right? So Alabama gets this paper. They write it, they turn it in, the professor reads it, and basically says, it's not the standard that I was expecting from you. I'm not going to give you the extra credit, right? Now, because it's an extra credit assignment, it's not going to hurt their grade, right? They could have gotten an F on the extra credit assignment. It's not going to hurt their grade in that way, right? It's just not going to help their grade, right? So essentially, because that Georgia game was a rematch of a game that they already won, where it was a tougher environment being in Georgia, everything like that. You kind of look at it like, hey, you could help yourself, right? You can go out and, go out there and get extra credit, but you're not going to hurt yourself because it is an extra credit assignment at the end of the day, right? And then there's BYU. Now, BYU, very similar to Alabama, told their mom, hey, I'm going to get straight A's this year, got A's in all the other classes, and the reason that they don't have an A in this class is because on the midterm, they bombed it pretty bad. Right? So their only really big test of the year, they didn't get the grade that they wanted. So they're sitting there at an 82 right now. Now, BYU's sitting there saying, hey, I need to get the straight A so, my parents don't get mad at me. Goes up to the professor and says, hey, look, I've done all my work on time. I haven't missed a class. Like, I've been here on time. I've done all the right things. Like, I'm doing everything that a student's supposed to do. I just messed up on one test. Is there any way I could just take the test again? So the professor, looking at them, basically goes, hey, you want to know what? You're right. You've been a really good student. I would like to see you take this test again, so that way, we can potentially raise your grades up. So this is what I'll do. I will let you make up the test, and whatever score you get the second time around, that's going to be your final score, right? So being as that it's a second test that you've already taken, you should do better than the first time around, so it should be pretty easy to get a higher score. But obviously, if you get a worse score because it's replacing your previous grade, it could obviously negatively impact you as well. So BYU takes the test. They end up doing even worse than they did the first time, and that's why their grade ended up going down. Right? So obviously, when you look at BYU, they played Texas Tech earlier in the year, lost bad. They played again in the conference championship game, lost even worse. Right? So now being that makeup test, they scored a D the first time. They got a D- this time. So now they went from a B- average in the class to a C+. So they tried to bet on themselves. They tried to give themselves a chance to do better. It didn't work out. Again, it shouldn't have even come to that in the first place, because I think BYU should have been in regardless, because I think the conference championship games are dumb. But to me, this is why it makes sense why they did what they did. Now, moving on to my personal final rankings, I would have shaken things up a little bit, right? So I would have had Georgia at 2 instead of Ohio State. I would have had Texas A&M at 6 instead of Ole Miss. And then I would have had BYU at 8. I would have bumped Oklahoma and Alabama down. And then I would have left Miami and Notre Dame out for Tulane and JMU. But to me, I think it's stupid that those conference champions are in anyway. So in my personal final rankings, I did away with conference champions being automatically qualified. And I did my next 2 best teams. And to me, that's Miami and Texas. Now, I know a lot of people who are, big Notre Dame truthers, they're going to look at this and go, how the hell can you not have Notre Dame in? They have the 2 best losses in the country. And just like I said before, guys, I don't care how good your losses are. I care how good your wins are. And Notre Dame
doesn't really have any good wins.
Right? So when I compare Texas and Notre Dame, I look at the strength of schedule as a huge disparity. And I look at the fact that when Texas played the good teams, they won more than they lost. And when Notre Dame played the good teams, they lost more than they won. Right? And the example that I'm going to give to this is kind of looking back at middle school, if you guys did this, but sometimes before a big test, the teacher would do a study game, kind of like Jeopardy or something, where basically you would get into teams, and then, there would be different categories, just like Jeopardy, 100 to 500, so on and so forth. And the reason that, I kind of compare it to this is because basically you're playing your game with your classmates, and you get down to the very last question. And the teacher basically goes, hey, you can choose one student that you want to send up to the front of the room to try to answer this last question. Whoever gets it right wins the game. Right? So you're getting in your little huddle with your classmates in your group, and you basically come to the conclusion that you either want student 1 or student 2 to take the last question. Right? So student 1 in this example is Texas, student 2 is Notre Dame. Now, throughout this game, in class, Texas has gone up 5 times. They have answered a 500-point question right, another 500-point question right, and a 400-point question right, while getting 2 500 questions wrong, and also getting a 100-point question wrong. Now, if you know anything about Jeopardy, 100-point questions are by far and away the easiest. A 4-year-old should be able to answer them. And then a 500-point question is obviously going to be pretty hard. You got to be pretty smart to be able to answer those questions. Right? So then looking at Notre Dame, when they went up there 3 times. They got a 200-point question right, but they got a 400-point question wrong and a 500-point question wrong. Right? So the only 2 times that they were faced with tough questions, they got them wrong. And one of the questions they got wrong, Texas came up right after them and got the same question right. So if you're choosing your classmate who you want to go up there and answer that question, to me it's a no-brainer that you would choose Texas. Right? Because they got 2 500-point, the toughest questions right, and they got a 400-point question right. So odds are they're going to be way more likely to get the 500-point question right, considering the fact that they've already proven that they're smarter than the other student because they got one question right that the other one got wrong. right? And in this example, that question that Texas got right and Notre Dame got wrong is the Texas A&M game, right? Notre Dame lost to Texas A&M. Texas beat Texas A&M, right? So there's a very fair comparison, and that's why, to me, Texas would be ahead of Notre Dame. So I know it's a kind of a long-winded answer. It makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to you guys, but that's why I'm not rewarding Notre Dame for what they did this year, because the only two tough games they played, they lost. Now, funny enough, last year was the exact opposite, right? Notre Dame was the one with the bad loss, right? They lost to NIU, and they came back and they beat 3 or 4 ranked teams, got into the playoff, and made it to the final, right? So last year was living proof that your good wins mean way more than any sort of bad loss, right? So for me, that's why I ranked the teams the way that I did, and that's why it makes sense to me. But also, too, I can admit that this system's flawed, right? And the reason that I think it's flawed is because we're leaving too much up to people and their opinions, right? The committee is an imperfect situation, right? So I've come up with 3 solutions that will kind of minimize, the mistakes that can be made. One of them obviously being a very easy to implement solution. The last one being a super hard to implement, super complex. It'll probably never happen, but it solves all the issues. And then some sort of middle ground that, could be realistic, right? So starting number 1, easiest solution is you expand up to 16 teams. You replace the conference championship games with play-in games. You take out the stupid automatic bids for conference champions, and you just put your top 16 teams in the playoff, right? Your highest 8 seeds will have a 1-week bye. Your highest 4 seeds will have a 2-week bye, right? So if this were to take place this year, using the last rankings that the committee came out with, your play-in games would be between Alabama and USC, BYU and Texas, Notre Dame and Vanderbilt, and Miami and Utah, right? Once those play-in games are played, you would essentially be exactly where we're at right now in the schedule, because the play-in games would replace the conference championship games, which took place last week on the 5th and the 6th. This weekend would obviously be the first round of the playoff games. The following weekend would be your quarterfinals. You would then have a week and some change off. You would do your semifinals on New Year's Day, and then you would have a week and some change to play on the following Monday, right? So overall, to me, it's a very simple solution. Obviously you're still leaving it up to a committee, but the way I kind of look at it is 16 teams is plenty enough. If you're, on the bubble at 17, 18, 19, to me, it doesn't really matter, because if you're that far down, you probably don't deserve to be up there anyway, right? So, I was looking at the bubble teams earlier. They're not very good. Michigan might be the best one, but at the end of the day, if you're that far down and on that bubble, you have no one to blame but yourself, because way too much went wrong for you this season anyway. So regardless, very simple solution. Pretty easy to implement. That's something that I could see them implementing as soon as next year. Now, number 2 is a reworked 12-team playoff. So what I would do is I would have 4 automatic bids for the top 4 Big Ten teams, and then 4 automatic bids for the top 4 SEC teams. And then what you would do is you would base it off of the conference record, so you would not have to worry about a committee ranking at all. And your top 4 this year, based off of the conference standings, would have been Alabama 1, Georgia 2, Ole Miss 3, and Texas A&M 4 for the SEC. And then top 4 for the Big Ten would have been Indiana 1, Ohio State 2, Oregon 3, and USC 4 for the Big Ten. Right now, looking at the 4 at-large bids for the other 4 teams in the playoffs, you would basically have the committee rankings take the next 4 best teams that are not in the SEC or the Big Ten. So this is the only place where the committee would actually come into play. And since they cannot take SEC or Big Ten teams, people cannot complain about conference bias, since they clearly favor those 2 conferences already. Now, this year would have been Texas Tech, Miami, Notre Dame, and BYU. So essentially, you would be left with a Big Ten tournament versus an SEC tournament. And how I would choose what at-large teams go where is whoever has the higher seed gets the 2 lowest ranked at-larges, right? So this year, Indiana was ranked the number 1 seed overall, right? They're a Big Ten team, so that means the Big Ten side of the bracket gets the 2 worst at-larges, whereas the SEC side would get the 2 better at-larges, just in terms of the committee's rankings, right? So you would have Indiana at 1 with a bye, Ohio State at 2 with a bye, with Notre Dame and USC playing a play-in to play Indiana, and then Oregon and BYU playing a play-in to play Ohio State. On the right side, you would have Alabama at a bye, Georgia at a bye, with Texas Tech and Texas A&M playing a play-in game to play Alabama, and then Ole Miss and Miami playing a play-in game to play Georgia. Now, with this system, the reason that I like it is because it minimizes the committee's impact on the tournament itself. Right? Like I already said, they're already pretty heavily favoring Big Ten and SEC teams, right? And as they should, right? Like 17 of the last 20 champions have come from those two conferences, right? So I know it might seem like a big deal putting 8 of the 12 teams in there automatically, but they're the two best conferences, and you can't really debate that, right? So if you really, are wanting to even it out a little bit, you could always up it to 16, create 8 at-large bids, and then just do the same play-in that I talked about in the last one, right? But regardless, the Big Ten and the SEC are the two best conferences. Those are the conferences that we want to see the most teams from anyway. Right now, still, in this solution, we are relying on a committee to make decisions. It's not going to be perfect, right? So my last solution, and the most extreme one, disables the committee altogether, right? So this is the blow it up and just completely realign the conferences solution, right? So what I would do is I would have 4 completely realigned super conferences. So you'd have your Northeastern, your Southeastern, your Central, and your Western. There would be 20 teams in each conference, and each conference would split into 2 tiers. You would have your upper division, which we consider A tier, and you would have your lower division, which is considered B tier. So your 10 best teams would be in your A tier, your 10 worst teams would be in the B tier. You would play 9 games against the 9 other teams that's in your divisional tier, right? So if I'm an A tier Northeastern team, I would have 9 games against other A tier Northeastern teams, and then I would have 2 games against B tier Northeastern teams, and then my last game comes from one out of conference opponent that I schedule. Right? Now, what you would do then is you'd then have a playoff for the upper division, and you would have a tournament for the lower division. And what this will do is it'll completely disable the committee, because it'll completely just go off of conference standings, right? And then what you could do, just to make sure that the lower division teams have a chance to still, play with the big guys and work their way up and do everything that they need to do, is you can have a relegation and promotion system on a season-to-season basis, just like they do in Europe for all of their sports, right? So your top 2 teams from the lower division every year would get promoted into the higher division. You could even reward the champion of the lower division tournament by giving them immunity for relegation for one season. And then you would just take your bottom 2 teams from the higher division and relegate them into the lower division, right? This makes teams, have to go out there and do the right things. It allows them to, constantly put the pressure on recruiting and coaching and, making sure that they're doing the best things possible. It just creates a more competitive environment for everybody. Every game's going to matter now. Now, to go through the qualifications, you would basically take your top 4 teams based off of the conference record in each A division conference to play in a conference tournament. So the winner of the A division conference tournament plays in a playoff against the other A division conference tournament champions. So the champion of the Northeastern Conference, the Southeastern Conference, the Central Conference, and the Western Conference. Then the A division conference with the most total wins amongst their top 4 teams would be on the same side of the bracket as the A division conference with the least amount of total wins amongst their conference playoff teams, right? So if the Northeastern has the most cumulative wins amongst their top 4 teams and the Central has the least amount of cumulative wins towards the top 4 teams, those 2 conferences would be on one side of the bracket while the other 2 are on the other side of the bracket. And then for the lower division, what you would do is you would take your top 4 teams in each conference, again, based off the conference record, and have them play in their own individual conference tournament. Now, the winner of these B division conference tournaments would get promoted from the B division to the A division, like I said before, and would be given a 1-year immunity. So that way, should they place in the bottom 2 the following year, they're protected from being relegated. They could stay in the same A-tier division until the following season. And then the runner-up of the B division conference tournament, they still get promoted. They just don't get that same immunity. So now, obviously, since we're talking about going off of conference standings and eliminating a committee, we have to have a fair tiebreaker. So looking at the tiebreakers, number one, easiest is head-to-head, right? If I play you and I beat you and we finish with the same record, I beat you, so I'm better than you, so I'm going up in the standings. Number two is going to be your record versus the same division, right? We play 9 games. If we're, in a 3-way tie scenario, but I have a better record in the same division as you guys, I'm moving on. Number 3 is your record versus the out-of-conference opponent you scheduled, right? So if I scheduled an opponent and I beat them, you scheduled an opponent and you lost to them, and the other team scheduled an opponent and they lost to them, I won my game, you lost your games, I'm moving on. Right now, if that's still tied, we go to the out-of-conference opponent divisional tier, right? We want to reward people for scheduling better teams. Right, so did you schedule an A division team, a B division team, or just a completely not even in the divisions team, FCS or other mid-major school? Because obviously we don't want to reward people for scheduling cupcakes. Now, moving on, we would then have the out-of-conference opponent winning percentage. So if I schedule an A-tier school that went 10-2, and you scheduled an A-tier school that went 7-4, my game was better than your game. So that's going to give me the advantage there. Nextly is going to be point differential between tied teams in their head-to-head matchups. So if Team 1 played Team 2, Team 2 played Team 3, Team 3 played Team 1, like they all played each other, right? The total points that you scored and the total amount of points that you gave up in those games would be added up, and whoever has the best differential in their favor would be the one ranked the highest out of those. And then lastly, you could do the same thing between all the conference games that you played, since you all have common opponents playing the same teams, and we can go based off it that way. And at that point, if it's still tied, you just flip a coin, I guess, right? But overall, I want to talk about the conferences now. So you have the Northeastern. This is essentially just the Big Ten Plus. So this is basically going to be, most of the teams from that conference. But in your A division, you have Ohio State, you have Michigan, you have Indiana, you have Penn State, Notre Dame, making them join a conference, Pitt, Kentucky, Louisville, Virginia, and Illinois in your A division. And then in your B division, lower tier, you would have Rutgers, Boston College, Michigan State, Cincinnati, Syracuse, Purdue, West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia Tech, and UConn. Now, moving on to the Southeastern Conference, this is going to be Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU, Auburn, Florida, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Miami, and Clemson making up the A tier. And then making up the B tier is South Carolina, Mississippi State, Duke, Georgia Tech, NC State, Wake Forest, Florida State, North Carolina, UCF, and USF. Going on to the Central, your A division is going to be made up of Texas A&M, Texas, Oklahoma, SMU, Missouri, Texas Tech, Iowa, Iowa State, TCU, and Houston. And your B division is going to be made up of Arkansas, Tulane, North Texas, Baylor, Oklahoma State, Colorado, New Mexico, La Tech, Kansas State, and Kansas. And then rounding out our last conference is the Western Conference. Your A division is going to be split between Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Utah, BYU, Boise State, and Arizona State. And in your B division, you're going to have Cal, Stanford, Minnesota, Washington State, Oregon State, UNLV, San Diego State, Arizona, Northwestern, and Utah State. So that gives you 80 teams in total, right? Yeah, 80 teams in total, making up 4 conferences. So plenty of teams to make up different standings and everything. Every team could obviously have a chance to get promoted or relegated depending on where they're at. So it's always going to keep things very interesting. Right now, giving you a potential playoff layout, I randomly generated records for every team in every conference, and I'm going to go through the tiebreaker scenarios with some of you guys, so you obviously understand why teams are getting placed in certain seeds and why they're being able to move up or down in the standings. Right, so starting off with Northeastern, their top 4 teams combined for 37 wins, which makes them the most out of all the other conferences. So they would end up being on the same side of the bracket as the Central because their top 4 teams only accumulated to 28 wins. Right? So Ohio State, they went 11-0 in their conference. Indiana went 10-1 in their conference. Notre Dame went 9-2 in their conference. And then Penn State grabbed the last spot at 7-4. The reason they were able to grab the last spot at 7-4 over Michigan and Virginia, because Penn State beat Michigan, Michigan beat Virginia, Virginia beat Penn State, and then when you went from tiebreaker order, head to head kind of locks out because they had the same records, but Penn State went undefeated versus the A division outside of their loss to Virginia, whereas Virginia lost in 2 games in the A division and Michigan lost 2 games in the A division. So since Penn State had the best record in the A division, they were able to move on. Moving on to the Central, because that's on the same side of the bracket, you had Texas A&M, Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech. The only tie there was between Texas and Oklahoma. That's a head-to-head matchup. Texas beat Oklahoma, so they were able to stay at the number 2 spot in the standings, and those are the 4 teams that move on there. Now moving on to the other side of the bracket, you have the Western, which is Oregon at 10-1, USC at 9-2, and then BYU and Utah both at 8-3. Again, this just comes down to head-to-head. BYU beat Utah since all these teams have to play each other once on that side. So, very easy solution there. And then you kind of have your weird scenario with the Southeastern because Georgia, Alabama, and Ole Miss all finished 10-1. And then you had LSU sneak in there at 6-5. So the tiebreaker with the Southeastern guys, Georgia beat Alabama, Alabama beat Ole Miss, and then Ole Miss beat Georgia. So the head-to-head locks out. They had the same record versus the A division, same record versus the B division, so that locks out. The record versus the out-of-conference opponent all locks out because they all won their out-of-conference games. All of them scheduled out-of-conference opponent A-tier divisions, so that all locks out there too. So now we move on to out-of-conference opponent winning percentage. They all scheduled 7-4 teams because Alabama scheduled Michigan, who they beat. Ole Miss scheduled Virginia, who they beat. And Georgia scheduled Texas, who they beat. Right? So they all beat 7-4 teams. So we move on to the next one, which is now point differential between tied teams in their head-to-head matchups. So the final score of the Georgia-Alabama game was 27-20 in Georgia's favor. The final score of the Alabama-Ole Miss game was 13-7. And then the final score of the Ole Miss-Georgia game was going to be 20-18 in Ole Miss's favor, right? So Georgia ended up having the best point differential since they beat Alabama by 7 and then only lost by 2, so that gives them a +5. Alabama had the second best point differential, and then Ole Miss had the worst point differential, so that's why they got ranked 1, 2, 3 there. Right now, to give you an idea of what the playoff would look like, your top 4 teams would play in a conference tournament. So you would have your Northeastern on the same side as the Central. So you'd have number 1 versus number 4, Ohio State, Penn State, 2 and 3, Indiana, Notre Dame. You'd have Texas A&M versus Texas Tech, Texas versus Oklahoma. And then moving on to the other side, you'd have Georgia, LSU, Alabama, Ole Miss, Oregon versus Utah, and USC versus BYU. And then looking at the dates, basically you would have a bye week between the last game that you play for the season and the first round of your conference tournament. You would then play in consecutive weeks from that second and third week. You would have kind of a week and a half break between your quarterfinal and semifinal game because the semifinal is just going to be played on New Year's Day. And then the championship game is going to be played that following Monday. So it's going to give you about a week and a half off there too. So overall, guys, the reason that I like this setup is because it completely eliminates any need for the committee. So it completely removes all of the human element to it, and it just puts you into more of a scenario where, hey, look, we're going to just judge you based off of the games that you played, and at the end of the day, if you slip up, you can't be mad at anybody but yourself because it's the same rules for everybody, and now you can't sit there and cry that there's favoritism or anybody's getting special treatment or whatever it may be. So to me, guys, this makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to hear what you guys think, though, so if you want to go ahead and just leave a comment below on what your thoughts were on the different scenarios here and kind of what your rationale is behind it. I'd love to hear some feedback and, maybe debate with some of you guys someday. But regardless, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. So I do appreciate you all for clicking on and sticking with it this long. Hopefully this made sense to you guys. And, Obviously, I want to be able to continue to make more content. So leave some suggestions down below on what you'd like to see next, and we'll see if we can fit it into a video. But guys, it's been real, and I'm out. Peace.